Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to the Lulu Essey Podcast. I'm Lulu, and today marks something truly special. It's the first episode in a 3-part series, and for the first time, you'll hear a conversation rather than just me. Before I tell you about that, you're going to want to share this episode with your loved ones, because there's not one of us who hasn't been affected by trauma in some way. Whether that's a life-changing event, ongoing stress, or a hidden wound. And today you might hear something that completely shifts how you see your own story. Back in April, I was interviewed by Hawa who is the co-founder of keepcalm.org, a non-profit championing mental wellness through advocacy, education, and community support. Hawa and I took a deep dive into the intersection of trauma and healing, exploring how we can reclaim emotional resilience, strengthen our mental fitness, and transform our relationship with the past. This is the first part of a 3-part trauma and healing series. This episode is edited, a first for this podcast, because it includes Hawa's beautiful voice. I would like you to be aware that when we recorded this interview, I was smack bang in the middle of a mental health relapse. I really wondered if I was in the right state to do the interview. If you are watching on YouTube, you will notice that my eyes weren't as bright and focused. They dart around the screen a bit, and my words aren't as fluid. But I showed up anyway. And that's the reminder I hope you take away. We don't have to wait to be at our best to share what matters. Life happens, and we can do the best we can with where we are at. Waiting for circumstances to be perfect is futile, and you could be denying yourself and others when you don't share your light. In part 1 of the series, we'll uncover what trauma really is and what it isn't, and how it shapes our inner world. We'll cover why our nervous systems are designed for resilience and how our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of wisdom. And there's one thing Hawa asked me that stopped me in my tracks, and you'll hear it before we finish. So let's step into the sacred space where we learn to hold both our wounds and our wholeness. And if this resonates, pass it on, share it, because these conversations can shift lives in profound and meaningful ways. So here's part 1 of our conversation. In terms of the intersection of trauma and healing and what it means to me personally, before I begin to address that, I want to be really clear that what I share today and in every conversation, I share from my personal lived experience with mental health challenges and my own healing, and specifically with bipolar disorder. And while I have really done a lot of work in educating myself extensively on these topics, I'm not a clinical professional. So what I share today comes from my own journey and what has helped me transform my relationship with trauma. And hopefully that will help others. But it's important for me to set that context. And just going on to my personal definition of trauma, I think for me, trauma isn't just the big, obvious events that we typically associate with the word. It's a big word. Trauma can be any experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope in the moment. And the most important thing about trauma is that it leaves an imprint on our nervous system. It's those moments where we feel unsafe, where we feel unseen or unable to protect ourselves, whether it's in a physical way or in an emotional way. And from my experience, I truly believe that trauma lives in the body as much as it lives in the mind. I feel like it's stored in our nervous systems and can be triggered years later by what seems to be really unrelated events. And what makes trauma, I think, particularly challenging is that it doesn't stay in the past. And it's like a lens. It's like a lens that we put on, and it colors how we see the present. It colors how we see the future. It affects how we see ourselves, and it does create protective patterns that may have helped us in the past survive very difficult times. But what then happens is that it limits our ability to fully engage with life now. And that's what I believe is important, is that ability to engage with life however it presents in the present moment. And then to look a little bit deeper at the intersection between trauma and healing, what I feel is like it's a sacred space where we are able to hold both our wounds and our wholeness, because I think it's really important that we can hold both at the same time. It's not about erasing what happened or pretending that we weren't changed by the trauma, but it's about acknowledging the trauma while not allowing it to define who we are. It's just a part of who we are. It's not the sole thing that defines us. And in my journey, I found that healing doesn't mean that the trauma just disappears and goes away. It means our relationship with it transforms. The pain, and that's what made me a little emotional, that once consumed everything, becomes integrated into a bigger, richer, more beautiful story about our lives. And I speak about it as learning to dance with the dark and the light at the same time. And I've spoken about this on my podcast. I love this question because I think what makes this particular intersection so powerful is that where our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest wisdom. The same experiences that broke us, that cracked us wide open, those experiences can create space for more authenticity, for more connection, and for more compassion. And in my own journey, I have discovered that really tiny, consistent actions towards healing gradually do build a life where joy and pain can coexist, and I can honor my own story without feeling like I'm imprisoned by it.
That was very deep, honestly. Thank you very much. I really love that. I think you made so much, gave me so much clarity, honestly, from someone who's like gone through so much trauma and really just like trying to understand it in as much as, you know, each and every trauma has its own understanding to things.
Of course.
I guess the next question to this topic would be understanding trauma and healing, right? So
Yeah.
how would you define trauma in the context of emotional and mental health? So what are some common misconceptions people have about trauma and healing?
When we think about trauma in the context of emotional and mental health, and you'll notice that sometimes I speak about mental health and sometimes I speak about mental fitness. Mental fitness is a term I prefer to use, and it's a term that I acknowledge Simon Sinek for, because it denotes something that's ongoing. You know, you don't get fit once and then stop. And I think that applies to mental health as well. Sometimes we think mental health has an end point. But when I think about trauma in the context of our emotional and mental health, I do see it as like this invisible architect of our inner world. Trauma doesn't just create these isolated, painful memories. It fundamentally shapes how we experience our world, and how we experience ourselves, more importantly. It becomes woven. It's like threads that become woven into the fabric of our nervous system. And it absolutely influences how we respond to stress. It influences how we form relationships, how we interpret everyday events, and even how we feel in our own bodies. Like I said, it's a lens that colors everything we experience, and often without us even realizing. And, you know, I think what makes trauma so significant to our mental fitness is that these responses aren't conscious choices. They're automatic protective mechanisms that once helped us survive. And I think that's really an important point to make. And the fascinating thing is that our brain doesn't have the ability to distinguish between past and present danger. So when something in our environment reminds us or triggers us over a past trauma, even subtly, the nervous system responds as if the threat is happening right now. And this is why addressing trauma is so fundamental to mental and emotional well-being. It's not just processing difficult memories. It's about transforming our relationship with our entire nervous system. And I think the nervous system component is really important. And it's reclaiming our capacity to feel safe, connected, and fully present in our lives. And you asked me about some of the misconceptions about trauma and healing, and I think there's several of them. These misconceptions can make the healing journey more difficult than it needs to be. For me, one major misconception is that healing from trauma requires reliving or retelling our most painful experiences in vivid detail. And I know that there are some therapeutic approaches that do involve processing traumatic memories directly, and they can be valuable for a lot of people, but this isn't the only path to healing. And I think for some people, it can actually re-traumatize them. And in my experience, trauma can happen through approaches that work in harmony with our body and our nervous system, without us necessarily needing to reactivate that painful trauma that happened and the full emotional charge of that trauma. There's another misconception, is that healing means we erase, take this giant eraser and we erase all traces of trauma, and that once we healed, we'll never feel triggered or affected by our past experiences again. But contrary to that, I found that healing is more about building our capacity to be with difficult emotions, to be with difficult sensations without being overwhelmed by them. So it's about widening our window of tolerance. It's not about wrapping ourselves up in cotton wool. And I think also another misconception is that, and I find this a lot with my clients, is that They feel that trauma is this linear process that happens very neatly with a clear endpoint. But what I've experienced healing trauma is more like, I love to think about a spiral, an upward spiral, where we revisit similar things at deeper levels, depending on where we're at in our lives. And some days feel easy and others feel really crappy. There is no graduation day where we get a certificate and we say, okay, you're healed. This is an ongoing journey of integration. And the last thing I want to say is that I think the most damaging of all the misconceptions around trauma is that it means that we are broken. This is a big one for me. And the truth is that our nervous systems are built for resilience. They design that way, and they have an innate capacity for healing when we give our nervous systems the right conditions for healing. Our trauma responses are not character flaws. They're adaptations that helped us survive, and they can be transformed. They can be transformed with patience, with consistency, with the right support, and with compassion. And if you'll allow me to share a personal experience of this sense of feeling broken, I carried this misconception with me because of the trauma I experienced during my childhood and up to the age of about 40, that I was fundamentally broken. I eventually realized that my healing journey wasn't about being fixed. This feeling of feeling broken, it colored what I believed was possible for my life. My responses to my trauma, my anxiety, my hypervigilance, my difficulty with trusting people weren't signs of brokenness. They were my mind and my body's intelligent adaptations that helped me to survive. So I think healing is less about erasing the past and more about reclaiming our wholeness. And that was always there, and it always has been there beneath the protective layers. And it was, again, about expanding my own capacity to hold the pain of what happened, but to also open the possibility of what could be. And from a clinical perspective, if there's one person, one clinician I can highly recommend who deals with trauma, and that's Dr. Gabor Mate. Now, I'm not an expert in his research, but his work resonated with me profoundly because his understanding is that what we view as pathologies, as illnesses or brokenness are actually intelligent adaptations to circumstances. And Dr. Mate explains that these patterns we develop, whatever they may be, a lot of them as addiction or anxiety or people pleasing, are actually not evidence that there's something wrong with us, but they were our survival instinct. They're survival mechanisms that helped us at a certain point in our life when we didn't feel safe. Our bodies and our minds adapted in brilliant ways to protect us. And people often overlook this. They don't realize that the trauma response is an intelligent one. It's a protective one. And his work shifted everything for me, expanding my capacity to hold both the pain of what happened and, as I said, the possibility of what could be. And it was a really big moment where I viewed myself as not needing to be fixed, but I began to approach my own healing as a process of understanding those adaptations with compassion and gradually creating new patterns of behavior.
I love the detailing that you gave as well. That was a lot of unpacking, honestly. But
there's a lot of unpacking because it's such a deep subject.
Yeah.
And I think the perspective from a clinician and from a person who has experienced trauma can be quite different. Both are valid and both are valuable, but we come at it from slightly different perspectives.
Yeah, it seems as though like it's hard to find any single human being in this universe that has not gone through some kind of trauma, honestly.
Absolutely. And I think, if I can just digress for a second, I think there, there was this time, and I think we're coming out of it, but there was this time where, you know, trauma can be replaced with the word wound, where we'd compare wounds and like whose wound is the biggest wound. And everybody would put their wounds on the table. And that is not helpful to anyone because everyone's experience is valid and there isn't a barometer or some kind of meter that measures the depth or the profoundness of a wound. It's your experience. So it's profound for you.
What an incredible conversation to kick off this trauma and healing series. Next week, in part 2, we'll explore the practical side of moving with and through trauma. We'll explore how to build emotional resilience while life keeps happening, because it does. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and tap that notification bell so you don't miss part 2. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, I'd be so grateful if you'd leave a review. It helps new listeners find these conversations. And share this episode with someone you care about who might be carrying more than they're saying. I have a weekly newsletter. Just email me at lulu@luluessey.com if you'd like to receive it. I'd love to add you. You can find the links for keepcalm.org and for Hawa in the show notes. And as always, what comes from the heart reaches the heart. And today, with profound respect for wherever you are on your healing journey, the messy parts, the beautiful parts, and everything in between, this comes straight from my heart to yours.